One of the many privileges of living in the United States is easy access to clean water, something many may take for granted. We hardly think about clean water when we turn on the faucet for a drink, yet issues of clean water often arise when a crisis emerges. The recent case in Flint, Michigan, for example, when heavy amounts of lead were discovered in the city's water, reminds us that clean water is not a given. When the people of Flint discovered their water was brown, they turned to bottled water for drinking and other household uses, including taking baths. People in the city went without clean water for more than 3 years before they were able to drink and use their water again. We are learning the horrible effects the case had on Flint residents, including 18 directly linked deaths. The tragedy was compounded because the city of Flint had ignored regulations set in place by the Clean Water Act of 1972, which could have prevented the disaster. The Clean Water Act was not the first time the United States created regulations to prevent contamination of drinking water. The federal government has been concerned with ensuring clean water since the Progressive Era in the late 19th century. Progressive activists during this time sought to improve the quality of life for all Americans. Municipal governments and scientists expressed worries with the issue of clean water as early as the 1870s, right up to the 1960s environmental movement and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Although Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, may have appeared as a bolt from the blue, the federal government and others were aware of the impact of the increased population and industry had on the ecosystem and human health decades before her book was published. The seeds of the modern environmental movement were not planted in the 1960s, but in the late 19th century. One of the earliest concerns for clean drinking water appeared in Chicago in the 1870s. The city grew during a population and industry boom in the wake of the American Civil War. A larger population meant a larger amount of sewage dumped into Lake Michigan, the same source the city drew its drinking water from. During the decades to follow, many people became ill. The most common illness was typhoid. The disease was caused by ingesting food or water that had traces of human or animal waste. Experts found that sewage was being circulated into the city's lakefront water supply. As a result, the city moved sewage pipes downstream of the drinking water source. Soon, treatment plants used mesh-like filters to treat drinking water. This process did not ensure bacteriological purification of water, but officials did recognize the correlation between polluted and safe drinking water. Events such as the one in Chicago led to the 1893 Interstate Quarantine Act, the first federal law to address the issue of clean water. The act attempted to minimize the spread of communicable diseases through interstate commerce, mainly the railroad system. It was revised in 1914, which added standards for transporting drinking water through interstate commerce. These standards were based on the bacteria content of water. If a sample of water from a source that supplied the railroad system showed to have too high a bacteria count, it was deemed unsafe and would be treated with chemicals such as bleach. Although this act did not regulate public drinking water in cities, it was the first example of federal government concern for drinking water in the United States. National regulation of all public drinking water was deemed unnecessary at the time by the federal government. It based this claim on reports from the country's largest cities that showed the rate of disease was too low to cause concern. Soon after the revisions, a report was published on an outbreak of typhoid in the city of Monroe in 1915 by Michigan State Medical Inspector James Fallon. His report provided several possibilities of the source of the outbreak, but he concluded the cause and spread of the disease was the city's drinking water. Fallon tested the water from Monroe's treatment plant using the standards set by the Interstate Quarantine Act, and found that the water was highly contaminated. Monroe's waste had circulated into the city's drinking water supply from sewage pipes located close to the treatment plants on Lake Erie. According to Fallon, Monroe's sewage was pushed by wind conditions into the city's water pipes. This situation mirrored the one in Chicago decades before and got the ball rolling towards national drinking water standards. State governments began to create their own regulations for drinking water. Most of these states established their own regulations based on the Interstate Quarantine Act. In 1917, Alabama's state health department created regulations that were more lenient regarding the number of bacteria in water. Virginia set standards in 1919 that a water source would not be investigated unless it was proven that the cause of an illness was water. If so, the case would be investigated in accordance with the bacteriological standards of the Interstate Quarantine Act. The effectiveness of the regulations varied by state. A second revision came to the Interstate Quarantine Act in 1925. It considered national regulation, but it was difficult in finding a universal standard for drinking water because different bodies of water required different levels of treatment. The Interstate Quarantine Act revisions in 1925 added regulations that dictated the level of certain chemicals in drinking water. By the early 1920s, many major cities in the country were banning lead pipes as experts reported the dangers of lead contamination posed to humans. Several cities, like New York and Chicago, were among the first to ban lead pipes. These regulations were set in place almost 90 years before the events of Flint, Michigan. Extraordinary events spurred scientific investigations into issues of tainted water. For example, in the Pikes Peak area in Colorado, people were showing a brown stain on their teeth and their tooth enamel was decaying. In 1935, a group of dentists studying the phenomenon found that the water in the Pikes Peak area had high traces of fluorine in it. Fluorine was often used in dental products to help strengthen and repair tooth enamel, but too much of this chemical can stain and weaken enamel. The source of fluorine was water runoff that had flowed down the local cliffs that were heavy in cryolite, whose chemical composition contains fluorine. In response to these findings, the Interstate Quarantine Act was again revised in 1942. The new revision set minimal contamination standards for fluorine and methods of removing it from drinking water. 4 years later, the standards were again revised. The 1946 law restructured existing regulations to make them more applicable to all water sources and served as a prototype for future legislation. The revisions were in response to the newly expanding suburbs and the fear of property values diminishing if drinking water was contaminated. This fear of property depreciation inspired the Federal Pollution Control Act of 1948, which was the first legislation that ensured clean water beyond interstate commerce. The act did not set guidelines for pollution. Rather, it allowed the federal government to provide funding to states and local areas to build waste treatment plants and to treat sewage dumped into water sources by industrial companies. One example was the American Viscose Corporation, which manufactured synthetic fibers for artificial silk in Virginia. In the summer of 1948, the Evening Star, a Virginia newspaper, reported that the State Water Control Board had installed treatment facilities to treat waste that the American Viscose Company was dumping into the state's waterways. The aim was to ensure the effluent would not be toxic to aquatic life. Polluted water systems were not a hot-button story in the United States from the late 1940s through the 1950s. But the media did cover the problems of water pollution throughout the country. For example, between 1948 and 1956, the New York Times published several articles on water pollution. Issues of contamination in New York State's water, especially the Hudson River, was covered several times. In 1955, the Times published an article that identified more than 40 corporations within New York that were polluting the Hudson River. These corporations faced fines and had their dumping practices curbed by the New York Water Pollution Control Board. Even states such as Florida, that did not have regulations concerning water pollution, began to consider legislation to address this issue. Revisions to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act were made in 1956 to strengthen the federal government's control over water pollution. The act established clear guidelines and a larger budget to combat water pollution throughout the country for the next 5 years. The United States issued $3 million in grants to every state to address water pollution. The act authorized up to $50 million to retrofit old and build new waste treatment plants across the United States. It also established the first Water Pollution Control Advisory Committee. This committee would be tasked with overseeing the operations of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act and helping in creating new legislation concerning water in the United States. By the 1960s, the issue of national water pollution was a greater public concern in the United States, including the White House. Revisions to the Water Pollution Control Act made in 1961 gained public endorsement by President John F. Kennedy, who created an even stronger resolve to fight water pollution in the United States. The original $50 million for treatment plants was increased by 60% to $80 million, and $25 million was added for field research in hopes of yielding better methods for treating polluted waters. By the early 1960s, the federal government was spending a greater amount of money to protect local economies, property values, and the health of the country's natural environment in the United States than ever before. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, revealed the damaging effects that pesticides had on the environment and humans. To support her claims, Carson cited all the federal legislation since the 1893 Interstate Quarantine Act. Her work is considered the birth of the environmental movement, but its roots lay in 19th and early 20th century federal legislation that began and continued to address clean water and its necessity to all American citizens.